Good morning. In this week's parasha, Tavo, we read about the mitzvah of bringing Bikkurim, that a person brings the first fruits of his land that grew in Israel every year to the Kohen in the Beit Mikdash, in the temple, and he makes an extensive declaration where he recounts much of the history of the Jewish people. He says, Arami obeyed Avi, an Aramean tried to destroy my father, referring here to the conflict between Lavan and our forefather Yaakov. V'yered Mitzrayim, and he went down to Egypt. V'yagor Sham, and he lived there. V'yareu otanu Mitzrayim, and the Egyptians were evil to us. V'nitzak el Hashem Elokeinu avotenu, and we cried out to Hashem. V'yaret onyenu, he saw our affliction. V'yotzienu Hashem biyad chazaka v'zronu tuyah, and Hashem took us out with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. V'yavienu al hamakom hazeh, and Hashem brought us to this place. V'iten lanu et haaretz hazot eretz zavat chalav u'devash, and he brought us to this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Ve'ata hinei aveiti et reishit pri hadama asher natati li, and behold, now I have brought the first fruits of the land which Hashem has given me. So you bring the fruits of your land, you make this declaration speaking about Jewish history and committing your fruit to Hashem in gratitude. And the Malbim asks a number of penetrating questions over here. The first one he says is, why are we telling this whole story? Where does this, why does this fit in? With no other mitzvah is it linked with a retelling of Jewish history. Secondly, why here are you bringing fruit of the land? He says, in fact, if you want to look back to the other time we read about an offering to Hashem of fruits and vegetables, it didn't work out so well. Referring, of course, to the story of Cain and Abel. The Torah tells us in Bereshit Perek Daled in Genesis chapter 4 that it says, V'yihi v'yaveh Cain mipri hadamah mincha laHashem. Cain brought from the fruits of the ground an offering to Hashem. V'hevel hevi gamu mibchoret tzono mechabayhem, and Abel also brought from the choicest of his flock and the fattest ones. And Hashem turned to Abel and his offering, but to Cain and his offering Hashem did not turn. Now the explanation that we are probably familiar with is that the Torah emphasizes Abel brought the best, choicest, fattest of his animals, and Cain brought. So the implication is that Abel brought the best and Cain did not bring the best, and that was what Hashem was rejecting. Now that may be true, but the Malbim points out that the Torah says, El Cain ve'el minchato lo sha'a. Hashem did not accept Cain, and he did not accept the offering, which implies that not only was there something wrong with Cain's attitude, with his approach, but that the offering itself was somehow problematic. The actual bringing of the fruit and vegetables was not good. And so, why over here are we bringing fruit and vegetables? So let's first deal with that question, then we'll come to the retelling of Jewish history. So he says that something quite amazing, that the problem with Cain was that he was living in a time before agriculture had really developed and before man was really in control of his world and his environment. We find that Noah was able to take control of that, and that in fact is one of the reasons he was called Noah, that he would bring us comfort from the difficulties of working the land. Noah is seen as in the Midrash as the father of agriculture, but before Noah's time it was very, very hard to farm. In fact, the Malbim says what this involved was Cain crawling around on the ground like an animal all day. Think about it, he had no tools, he hadn't domesticated animals, he was planting everything with his hands in the ground, taking it out with his hands from the ground. He said he was working incredibly hard and working in the dirt on all fours. He said this was a great disgrace to the dignity of the human being, and it undermined the greatness of the person created in the image of God. And so the problem with Cain's sacrifice is that this was something that lowered the person. This was something that took away a person's sense of dignity and greatness, wasn't conducive to the mission statement of a human being created in the image of God. Very interesting, which in Israel, he says, didn't apply. In Israel, they already had invented agriculture. It was a wonderful land. It was a very fruitful and productive land. They had animals that were able to assist them in their work. And so he says it was a different story altogether, and therefore this was a much more productive way. The problem, but I think it's such an amazing thing, that the problem with Cain was how it undermined his confidence. And Hashem wants you to be strong, confident, and to feel a sense of your own holiness. The second idea, he says, is that part of the idea of bringing Bikkurim is the idea that Hashem owns the land of Israel, and we are like sharecroppers, like tenants. The idea of a sharecropper, which was very well known in ancient times, is I own a field, and you work that field for me. I basically lease the field to you, and in exchange for you doing the farming, I get a percentage. And what would happen was, you would bring me the percentage as a gift. Normally there was a symbolic act where you would bring me a basket of fruit to show that you don't think you're the owner of the land. You acknowledge that I'm the owner of the land, and you are paying me the rent for using the field. So he says that's part of the idea. But when the Jewish people are showing that Hashem is in control of Israel and have given us jurisdiction over it, he says, now comes the question of, do we have a right to the land? Because he says, and it's amazing how topical and relevant his words are today, because he says there is a constant retelling of the Jewish story. There are constant attempts to make us out not as the rightful recipients of Hashem's gift of Israel, but as some sort of thieves. And he says that starts all the way back when they say Yaakov was a thief and he stole the birthright from Esav, and then he went to Lavan and he cheated Lavan by taking his daughters and going, and then he ran down to Egypt and they tried to do something in Egypt but it didn't work out, and then they were thrown out of Egypt, and then they waged war against the Canaanites, and they waged war against the Canaanites, and they conquered and occupied the land. And he says at this time, when we are taking possession of the land, we need to come in and show it's not what happened. That's not the story. There's another side. This, in fact, is our gift from Hashem. We were persecuted by Lavan. We went down to Egypt for respite. We were persecuted in Egypt. But Hashem has always taken care of us, and Hashem brought us to this land. So the idea is that we need to re-emphasize and tell our story for ourselves. We need to remind ourselves that we belong in Israel, not because of might or strength of arms, but because Hashem ha'aretzum lo'ah, it is God who owns the entire world and everything in it, and he has given it to us as a gift. We are the custodians of the land of Israel because that was God's decision. So the two ideas of Bikkurim, how is Bikkurim different to the offering of Cain, because he did it in a way that degraded him, but we do it in a way that uplifts us. Why do we retell the story? Because when we are involved in speaking about our ownership of the land of Israel, we must do so in a way that reflects that it is a gift from Hashem. It is not something that came to us through any sort of deceit, or through strength of arms, or through conquering, but because Hashem, the creator of heaven and earth, has assigned this as a heritage to the Jewish people. Have a wonderful Shabbos.